Well, welcome to Dawn or Doom, Day 2. Thank you for coming. I have the honor of introducing Laurel Weldon. She is a distinguished professor of political science and director of the Purdue Policy Research Institute. She is co-editor of the Journal of Politics, Groups, and Identities. Her work focuses on the role of social movements in influencing public policy, violence against women, representation, women work in poverty, and diversity and inclusion. She specializes in comparative research that is global in scope and has consulted for international organizations such as the UN and the World Bank. Today she will present a talk titled, How Technology Relates to Women's Access to Markets, Especially Financial Inclusion. Please take a moment to silence all electronic devices, but don't put them away. We hope to see you tweeting to the hashtag Dawn or Doom, and if you would like to tweet to Laurel Weldon, it's at @Laurel Weldon. It's on the sides. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Casey. I do just want to correct my title. That's not my title. My title is Technology and Women's Rights, How New Technology Could Resolve or Worsen Some of the Most Pressing Problems of Gender Equality Around the World. So, not sure how the other title got floating around, but that's not it. So, I wanted to first of all start by thanking Jerry McCartney and the Dawn or Doom team for giving me the opportunity to talk to you guys all today. And thank you to all of you for coming out to listen to my talk when there's so many exciting things going on. I want to pick up on a couple of themes that have been going on throughout the conference and were hit by the keynote speaker last night, for those of you who enjoyed that speech, which is partly about thinking about the ways that technology and society relate to each other. And you may remember that he used this Jetsons image last night, and I want to pick up on that a little bit again today, to think about the ways that we go wrong when we imagine how technology is going to affect our lives if we don't have a complete picture. And the other image that I have up here that I'll talk about in a minute, is an image that reflects the news that just yesterday, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia rescinded the ban on women driving. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about in terms of technology and society, and I'll say why in just a minute. I did want to just introduce myself, and Casey did a great job of introducing me, but I did want to mention that I'm the director of the Purdue Policy Research Institute. And at the Purdue Policy Research Institute, we are working on supporting faculty, students, others who want to find viable solutions for the wicked problems of the world, global grand challenges. We want to help solve those global goals, reach those global goals. So we're working on doing that in an interdisciplinary way, supporting faculty who are doing that, helping students learn how to do that. So if you're interested in knowing more about PPRI, please visit our website, which is purdue.edu/Discovery Park PPRI, and I'd be happy to tell you more about it too if you want to. So let me get back to this theme about technology and society and the Jetsons view that I wanted to start off with. And this is the view that technology is going to make us free and equal, right? That if you remember the old Jetsons story, the kind of burden of care work or the burden of domestic work carried by the wife in the little Jetsons family was alleviated because all she had to do was press a button. And there was dinner, and all she had to do was press a button, and all these domestic things were just prepared by technology. And so issues of gender inequality in the family solved by technology. And people imagine that, for example, class divisions will be solved by economy. Work will disappear. We'll all live lives of leisure while robots prepare our meals and clean the toilets. So all of advancing technology is going to solve all of our social problems. But really, what I want to try to have us think is that's sort of maybe that's a Dawn version of the Dawn or Doom version. And last night we heard a more doomish version, or as Professor Bess called it, the Chicken Little version of history. And I want to maybe suggest something in the middle, which is that we want to pay attention to the social context in which technology is embedded. This kind of, the way we think about technology, the way we can use technology, depends on the context in which it is placed. It can even, and it's pretty amazing how much the social context limits our use of technology. It even limits our imagination, and this is something that I think was particularly well emphasized by the keynote speech last night as well. So let me just point out something about the spread of technology and whether technology translates quickly into social change. And I want to go back to this example that I started with of the women driving in Saudi Arabia, and this being the first day, really, that we are living in a world where the government has promised. They don't actually have the right to drive yet. But the government of Saudi Arabia has promised, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has promised to rescind this ban on women's driving, and that women will have access to driving cars. Now, it was in the late 1800s, as you probably know, that we had the first kind of modern cars developed, and the Model T Ford has been around since 1908 in its heyday in those first years of the 20th century, which means that it's been about 100 years before women in Saudi Arabia got the right to drive this car. So let's just remember that what was blocking women's access to the car in Saudi Arabia wasn't technology, because the technology has existed for a long time. What blocked their access? Well, it's the thing I was just talking about. It was the social context. And again, it's not the fact that just, suddenly, women never wanted to drive and now today they do. Women have been demanding to have the right to drive in Saudi Arabia for a long time. And in fact, I think it was in 2016 or 1990, one of the New York Times writers called them the Freedom Riders, referencing the civil rights protests here in the United States, because they went downtown, drove their cars, and engaged in civil disobedience, which, around here, might not have the same effect going around and driving a car, but they were violently repressed, they lost their jobs, and overall, they suffered greatly for the protests that they mounted. Yesterday, they prevailed. So there is change, and we can see women get access to technology, but we have to remember that the social context limits how that technology, whether that technology is available, how it's used, and that we also collectively decide that use. So I'm going to try to develop this idea a little bit more as we start thinking about women's economic rights. So let me tell you this story about Saima from Lahore, Pakistan. You may have heard her story before, since she's a success of the microcredit programs. People have, there are some of these stories that become better known, but still let me tell you about her. She's a woman who lived in poverty in Lahore, Pakistan. She lived in a terribly poor household. Her husband was unemployed. He was an abusive man who beat her every day. She had very little hope, very little despair. Her situation became so bad, she didn't have enough food to feed her family. She felt like she had to send her daughter to live with her aunt to make sure that everyone could get enough food. This is a very dire situation. Things even got worse. She felt that her husband's abuse was getting worse. In desperation, she fled from the household. Her husband's family was mocking her, saying, "You're so pathetic, you can't even look after your own children." She left her house in despair, and she fell in to signing up with a microcredit organization that gave her a small loan. She was able to use this small loan to develop a successful embroidery business. She bought beads, she got fabric. She was very successful. She managed to turn the profits of that little endeavor into even a larger endeavor. She ended up employing her neighbors. She was able to educate her daughters to get running water, to buy a television. She really felt like she was a success after all this, and she even had her husband working in her business ultimately, and felt that her life had been transformed by this small economic investment in her life that she was able to use to develop some money in her own name. So one thing I want to say is that this is a hopeful story, but not all women have access to this kind of a story right now. Even if we think that this is a good story, not all women can do this. There are many women find themselves in this position of being subject to violence. Globally, the World Health Organization estimates that more than 1 in 3 women, about 35% of women in the world, are subject to sexual violence, to intimate partner violence in their lifetime. In addition, every day, more than 800 women die because of pregnancy or childbirth-related causes that are entirely preventable. 99% of these maternal deaths are in the developing world. And again, this is a place where global poverty affects both women and men. Nearly 1 in 5 people are in poverty, in extreme poverty in these developing countries, living on less than $1.25 a day, and half of these people are women and girls. So there are a lot of these women who are living in these kind of same situations that seem very desperate, and not just the amount of money, but we think that about 1 in 3 women have no say at all in their family finances in these countries. So you can imagine you don't have any money, you don't have access to it. And more than half of women in sub-Saharan Africa lack access to their own income. So when we're thinking about, oh, this woman could go out and start this business and have all these positive outcomes, I mean, not to say that that's the whole story, but at least it seems like she was able to better her situation, and that's what she said. But that is, not a situation that is necessarily easy. Now, if she was able to do this, why don't more women go out and just start businesses and get access to money? Well, I want to point out that there are lots of barriers to women being able to access money in their own name, any amount of financial independence or autonomy. In 2015, more than half of the women in the Global South did not have access to a bank account. So if you think about that, it is very hard to do any of the other formal things you might do in an economy if you don't have a bank account. Also, the World Bank did a study in 2016, so this is a very recent study, of 173 economies. This is basically most of the economies in the world, and found that 90% of them have formal legal rules that block women's access to economic opportunities. So these are not, murky things that we can't measure. These are actual laws that make it difficult for women to do the things that we think of as participating in the economy. So there are formal rules that prevent women from doing that. So what kinds of rules are these? As I mentioned, some places it's illegal for women to open a bank account. Other places, they have to provide ridiculous standards of documentation to the point that many people just judge it as being impossible. How can they possibly meet these standards? Some places women can't have property in their own name. There are inheritance problems. There are lots of different rules that make it difficult for women and men to be on an equal footing in economic terms. And even when they are not formally discriminatory, like I just described, sometimes these rules can disadvantage women because they end up being less likely to have these formal documents in the first place. So even if they were equal, the requirements, women would be disadvantaged because of their lack of access to documentation. Other issues. So again, this kind of goes to where we're talking about this. Technological developments are likely going to make this problem worse for women rather than improve it in the short term. Women have a lack of access to computers and cell phones, so as we are moving to a digital economy, these women who don't have access already to the economy are likely to be left further in the dust. Why don't they have access to, say, a mobile phone or a computer? Well, cost, as you might imagine, is a huge issue. They can't afford it. Also, there are cultural barriers. Men sometimes prohibit women from owning phones. They don't want them, or they don't let them use it. They monitor their usage. Also, in some places, women may feel discomfort or be unwilling to violate norms about having interactions with men to whom they're not related in financial institutions like banks. They don't want to go to a bank and open a bank account because they'll have to interact with a strange man, which would affect their honor or their reputation in some communities. So take the example of Bangladesh. In the digital economy, and I mentioned Bangladesh because the digital economy there, this switch to a digital economy is tremendous. 80% of people in Bangladesh do not have traditional bank accounts. So most of the economy here in terms of everyday people like you and me is not being done in brick and mortar bank accounts. So even though we see this change, this is kind of a sign of where things could go, right? So 72% of men have mobile phones, but only 44% of women do. And this means that already we see big disparities in the use of the digital economy in Bangladesh right now. So only 13% of women have used mobile money, while 33% of men have. So a much larger proportion. So you can see that what starts out as being an unequal situation is worse as this transformation occurs. And this is true across the Global South. I use the example of Bangladesh because of the pervasiveness of the digital economy. But this is true to some degree, right? It varies by region. But it is true to a great deal across the Global South. And more than 1.7 billion women in these regions do not have access to a mobile phone. Again, cost is the greatest barrier, and security and harassment is another barrier. Yeah? Oh, thank you for saying that. So when I say Global South, I'm meaning like not the south of the United States. So we might say the South, or if we were in Canada, sometimes we'd say south of the border, and we'd mean the United States. But here, when I say Global South, I mean Africa, Latin America, some parts of the Middle East maybe, and Asia. So, but really, when you're talking about the Global South, most people are referring to like lower and middle income countries rather than the wealthier countries south of the equator. So it's kind of a jargony term. Thank you very much for mentioning it to me, getting me to clarify that. Okay, so also, Many women do not have phones because of security and harassment that they endure trying to get access to these phones. So having said that, I started out by saying technology might improve women's status, and this probably sounds like, well, why is she saying that? That's pretty dumb. It looks like women don't have access to these phones. Why do we think a cashless economy might improve access for women? Well, if we can get women access to these mobile phones, it could be very helpful for them. Why would it be helpful? Well, a few kind of obvious things, maybe based on what I've said, is that if women could get bank accounts on their cell phones, that would be hugely helpful. So for example, a lot of places it's very dangerous for women to travel from one part of the region to another, one village to another. And one huge obstacle to having a bank account is having to travel to another community to open a bank account. Now, if you can do that over your phone and never leave your community or even your house, you don't have to expose yourself to that risk. You also don't have to arrange childcare or have somebody else take on your domestic responsibilities while you undertake what could be a more onerous journey. So it makes it more accessible in that respect and addresses some problems that are unique to women. It also means that women don't have to hand over their paycheck to men to deposit them if they don't have a bank account. They don't have to lose the access to their money right away. They can deposit their money in their own account, or even sometimes, increasingly, have that money deposited directly to their account, which they can then access to their phone, and nobody else ever sees the money or even knows it's there, obviously in that direct way. It gives women much more kind of direct control over their own money, and makes it more difficult for others to take their money away from them or appropriate their funds. So that is some of the reasons why people think this might be helpful. And just to give you a couple examples of things that people are doing, people who are thinking this might be a way to improve women's access to some of these economic opportunities. In Nigeria, for example, Diamond Bank and Women's World Banking have worked together to develop a kind of special savings account that's designed especially for women. It's called a beta account. And why did they, when I say it's designed specially for women, what do I mean? It has, it can be opened over the phone. It has no minimum balance and no fees, which is important because lots of times women have small amounts of money that they want to put in these accounts, and they want to make frequent withdrawals. So if you can make small, frequent withdrawals without having all your money disappear in fees, that's a huge advantage, and these accounts are designed to do that. They're available to both men and women, but they, as I said, they were really designed with women in mind. Also, MasterCard, and we can talk about this, involvement of corporations in these different initiatives afterwards. I'd be interested in talking about that if anybody wants to. But MasterCard and UN Women have also worked together to develop an initiative that aims to improve women's access to electronic identification cards. And this is a way that they can kind of carry around a card that gives them the ability to make electronic payments. So again, it kind of gets around some of the technological problems of having to travel somewhere, have a brick and mortar bank account. Other examples. In Tanzania, they've now created a system where health workers can give birth certificates on their mobile phones to women. So again, if we can give women these mobile phones and they can get these birth certificates, then all the problems we talked about in terms of documentation become less severe. Women can use these documents, these kind of mobile phone documents, to access all kinds of government services that they would benefit from, health services and so on. And in Somalia, there was another effort to kind of address some of these barriers by having an all-women staff or having female staff, so that again, this problem of not wanting to go to the bank because you're worried about interacting with men, you go and interact with women, and it dramatically increased the proportion of women, the proportion of the customer base that was women. So it really did result in tangible, very immediate, right, increases in the number of women using the services of the bank, which suggests that this actually makes a big difference, to offer women the opportunity to to interact with and be served by other women. There are also some ideas about trying to improve women's access to credit that rely on big data. And these are this would be another good thing to talk about if we wanted to talk more about this. But this is kind of like data mining techniques that use patterns of behavior to try to predict your creditworthiness. Okay, so why would you want to do this? Well, one kind of reason you might want to do this is because of this documentation issue, right? So you turn up, you're not a credit risk, but you don't have any documents. So, I'm a bank, I want to give you money. What basis do I have? Well, one thing that people are talking about is saying, well, what if I somehow use big data or some kind of a digital analysis to predict, based on your characteristics, that you're not going to be a credit risk. Then I have a basis for giving you credit, even a small amount of credit at least, that will be better. Of course, the downside of that is a little obvious, or some of the concerns here are rather obvious in the sense of, you know, we all have seen the Facebook and other algorithms run amok. I don't know if anybody has been enjoying the maternity store advertisements that have been sent to all kinds of people who are not in the market for maternity things over the past couple of weeks. I mean, there's plenty of errors that are made. There are privacy issues. There are all kinds of questions that are arising with these algorithms and these big data. But I did want to mention it as another way that people are thinking about using technology as a kind of alternative way to establish creditworthiness for women that doesn't depend on some of the documentation that we use traditionally to establish these issues. So if we are able to kind of get women better access to mobile phones, we might be able to address some dimensions of some of the problems that I mentioned at the beginning, right? Some small piece of it. And I wanted to mention one other thing that came up that struck me as being particularly interesting. And I actually heard this on the way in when I heard one of the Saudi Arabia drivers on the way in talking on the radio. And she said that, you know, she didn't drive in 1990 for herself. She drove in 1990 for all women, to kind of say all women should have the right to drive. And she said that the ability, now that the kingdom has rescinded the ban on drivers, she feels that her dignity has been restored. She feels, you know, that there's a question of being humiliated by not being able to drive, and that now she has the dignity of being able to drive herself. I thought that was a very interesting comment, and it relates to what I'm saying here, because some women reported as parts of these efforts that were really just about kind of trying to find ways to give women money in their own name, and really maybe didn't even have a broader agenda. One of the things that's been interesting is some of the unexpected results of that. So some of the women who were given, like, just cash cards, fingerprints, whatever, said, I exist now. This means I exist. I'm official. I exist as a person. And reported really pretty profound experiences, feeling very profoundly recognized by a process that really wasn't aimed at, you know, providing women with empowerment in that particular sense, or making women feel dignity, or anything like that. I don't think people didn't want to do that, but it wasn't the goal. The goal was to say, oh, you're going to go hungry. How do I make sure you have money? How about take this card? And next thing you know, women were saying, well, it actually made me feel like I've never felt before. So it's sort of interesting to think about what it means to be recognized as being officially a person in these cases. And that these identity documents, smart cards, and even phones can make people feel like they're part of something that they aren't when they don't have the ability to kind of participate on their own rights. I mean, of course, these other kinds of spillover effects depend not on, you know, women's feelings or other areas of women's rights, but on the broader community. What does it mean to make sure that women have money in their own name, that women have access to their own money or control over their own income? What are the effects on families, on countries? And these are kind of well known, but I'll just mention them again anyway, that women, more than men, are likely to invest in their own families. They're more likely to spend their money on nutritious food. They're 10 times more likely to spend their money on things that will benefit their family than are men. They're more likely to improve child well-being. In families where women have access to the money, the children are more likely to live and more likely to thrive. Also, now this goes back to the corporate logic, and I'm interested to talk to some of you about this. There may be an economic development or growth logic to investing in women, and I don't know if people have followed the recent trends in womenomics or you know, investing in women. There's really become a realization that you can make money from investing in women, that women are a good economic bet, and recognizing that when you hold back half the population, you're actually cutting off a huge a portion of your ability to thrive as a society, as an economy, as a country. And as people have realized this, they've been more interested in investing in women. So as Melinda Gates wrote in the New York Times a couple years ago, I think this is specifically about the digital economy, a decade from now, economies in developing countries will be increasingly dependent on digital financial services. Will we limit growth for everyone by leaving the world's poorest women trapped in a shrinking cash economy? Or will we invest in our future by empowering these women to invest in theirs? So we can think about this kind of broader economic development or even a growth model as a reason for trying to make sure that women have these have access to this kind of digital technology and are part of the digital economy. So if we don't pay attention to it, right, if we see this trend, if we think about the Bangladesh example, I mean, it does seem like we're moving to a digital economy, although it'll be uneven, lots of different things. You know, we don't want to forget our Saudi Arabia example, right? I mean, it's not going to just happen tomorrow, and it's not going to happen everywhere in the same way. But still, it is a trend, and will it make things worse for women, or will it make things better for women? So, you know, I think that I don't want to have, I'm mentioning a lot of different ways that, you know, these kinds of technologies could make things better for women. But I don't want to be, I don't want to make it sound like I think that technology will be a silver bullet for, you know, advancing gender equality, but I do think it could make a difference. In order to address the kind of bigger problems of gender equality, we'll have to be addressing some of these problems at their roots. And the example for this, I would just say, is the example I gave about the mobile phones, right? So I don't want to travel to the next village over because I don't want to be attacked by people on the street, or I don't want to have to leave my kids or whatever. Well, that's good, right, that I don't have to, because of these problems of being threatened by violence, that they're not compounded by a lack of access to the economy. But it's not a solution to the problem of violence to have me open a bank account in my own phone. So I just wanted to mention that it doesn't solve the problem that really I shouldn't have to worry about being sexually assaulted on the way to the bank, right? So, you know, that problem remains. And really, we're going to see the biggest payoff for these kinds of technological problems if they're embedded in a broader process where we're thinking about all of the dimensions of gender equality and thinking about technology as being part of that broader social change, rather than as a single lever we can press, Jetson style, to bring us to gender equality. So we should not overlook technology as being part of this, but we also don't want to pretend that it's going to be a silver bullet. Do we use technology for the better, or do we allow it to reinforce inequalities? This is the same question that was raised in the keynote to some degree, right, last night. We have a choice. This is something that we choose collectively. What are we going to do with designer babies or all the other technologies that are available to us? We can harness the power of technology to ensure that it is part of this broader strategy for economic equality if we so choose. But we can make sure that it will provide a leg up. It can be part of our effort to provide a leg up to women in the developing world if that is what we want. So those are the choices that we have in terms of thinking about technology and women's rights in contemporary society.
I spent the last 5 minutes trying to find the access to this online, and I can't find it. But Purdue has a program that does exactly what you're talking about, and I'm trying to think of the gentleman.
Oh, Alok Chaturvedi. Yes, yeah. On mobile phones, yes.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
Can you share a little bit with us?
Well, he'd be better at representing his own project than I will be, because I'm not involved in his project. But I do know a little bit about it. I mean, the main thing that I know about it is that he is trying to make sure to use mobile phones to give women access to all kinds of things, including the economy. But one of, as I recall, and this might be wrong because, as I said, I'm not an expert on his project, I think there's also an element of his approach that allows women who are not literate to be able to access access some of these services, which is a huge deal because you know, a lot of women are illiterate in parts of the global south, not everywhere. So you know, this being able to access services by using images or other kinds of things, touchpads, is a little bit easier than having to read documents if you're illiterate. So that's another kind of advantage. But yes, that's a very interesting and important project that we're proud that Purdue is undertaking. Any other questions? Yeah?
I don't know if you saw Bob Clinton's speech yesterday from last night.
No.
He was secured at a meeting, and he was talking about ways that Monsanto is trying to help farmers in developing nations.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things he talked about was all the data that they have about agriculture today. He said like 17 different layers of data, and so what they're doing is they're pushing out crop and weather information to farmers via their cell phones to help them make decisions. And I'm just wondering, do you see that being something good for women in developing nations that are running their own farms? Because obviously there might be a cost or access barrier to obtaining it?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned, a cost is the main barrier, right, for women and for everybody, because it's worse for women because women tend not to have the money to buy these phones, but it's the main barrier for everybody. So first, I mean, all these things are possible if we can get women access to mobile phones or computers or whatever, but right now they don't have that. So, I guess I think that if we are able to get access to these phones, so a key thing would be to find a cheaper way, and there are ways that, some places they are piloting kind of lower cost ways to get mobile phones to women and to everybody, right? So if they can keep that up, that will make it possible for all kinds of things that we can do to make it to give people information that they need that will be useful to them and so on. Yeah. So I do think it's possible. I'm not sure what would be the first thing that you would want to have information you would want to be provided. Probably there might be some specific information that would be interesting, but I think it's an interesting idea. Yeah. TJ.
First, I want to say thanks for your talk. We didn't get a chance to. Oh, I'm sorry. We did not get a chance to thank you for your talk. So I want to. But I'd like to follow up on the last comment question. I didn't see any of the events yesterday, I'm sorry to say, and I certainly did not see the representative from Monsanto speak. But that raises, for me, a central question that you're speaking to around what is technology going to allow women to participate in. So mostly we're kind of talking about making sure that women have access to a system that is vastly exploitative and unequal. Not that I disagree that being outside the banking system doesn't mean you're in any kind of privileged space of innocence and freedom. But when Monsanto talks about getting women access to phones or being able to draw women into their economic system, clearly the reasoning has everything to do with Monsanto's profit making. So we have to look at the ways in which the very same forces of technological advancement, such as transnational corporations, are all about monopolizing resources in the global south and making sure that those women are contributing to the profit making rather than necessarily the kind of tangential or unintended consequences which we might celebrate. For instance, what that card kind of means to someone culturally and psychologically. So I think we have to be really careful when we have scholarship and events like this that are meant to get us to think very deeply and seriously about implications of technology without embedding that in a critique of transnational corporate monopolization and capitalism. So just the mention of Monsanto's kind of raises my hackles a bit, knowing all that Monsanto's has done around the world to monopolize those natural resources and take ownership away from people of land and water and food and access. So I just
it's a
have
great
to say that.
It's a great point, and it's something that I was thinking throughout as I was mentioning a few times, because it's a theme, of course, that comes up very much when you're thinking about questions about women in development, questions about women's economic rights. Right now, it's a very germane question. There's been in 2013, the Association for Women in Development presented a report about the declining funding for women's organizations at the grassroots. And as part of that report, they also talked about the ways that a lot of investment that remains is this kind of invest in women stuff that I mentioned, this womenomics. And so in a lot of ways, the AWID report said, what effect does it have to have an investment in women project because it's profitable, replace a project that's trying to invest in women to empower women? Right? They're not necessarily as we were just sort of saying, there's all kinds of things that can happen. It's not that they're necessarily different, but they're also not necessarily the same. And replacing a project that's a human rights-oriented project with a project that's an investing in women in order to make money project might be missing some things that were there in the initial effort. So as we see less money for women's rights, for women's organizing, and the money that exists is more of this kind of womenomics variety, invest in women, what effect does that have? So, I mean, one thing to point out also is that lots of the people who want to use mobile phones to encourage women are people who are industry organizations in the mobile phone group, right? Because this is 2 billion customers that are going to, well, not just women, 1 billion, but there'll be a couple billion people who will have access to mobile phones. This is a huge untapped market for businesses. So, but exactly. But I mean, is it bad? I mean, can we? I think that's a very real question. So, for example, I mean, in some ways, thinking about driving in Saudi Arabia is a pretty relevant point here, which is that, can we have a foothold in the economy at all without some of these technologies? And what are we having a foothold in? I mean, so I think there's a question of, can we think about creating a fair economy or an inclusive economy or building one economy, whatever we want, if women aren't in there in the first place? So, and I think while it's useful to maintain a critical perspective, particularly as people in academics, that's our job, to try to take a step back and think about the long game. I also think that we don't want to be in the position of not recognizing, as TJ mentioned, the issue of kind of romanticizing what it's like not to have a bank account, or romanticizing what it's like not to have any money, or to be unemployed, or to be outside the economic system. I mean, marginalization is a kind of economic oppression that pushes people outside the economy. So there's exploitation in the economy, but we don't want to mistake marginalization for freedom. Being pushed out of the economy is not the same as freedom. So we really have to think carefully about how to involve women in the economy in a way that will be good for everybody. That'll be good for women, good for families, good for our societies. But I do think that it's important to try to think about how to get them into that economy in the first place. So there's actually a really good book on this for people who are interested that's sort of trying to explore some of these questions called Scandalous Economics, if you're interested in it. And it really kind of takes up some of these questions and examines all of these programs run by the World Economic Forum and others. UN Women, it's very critical of UN Women, which, as I mentioned, is partnered with MasterCard and other corporations, is saying, why is UN Women partnering with corporations? Well, I think that's something for us all to be thinking about as we're trying to think of these questions about women's economic rights. I see just one other question right here. Yeah.
So you spoke quite a bit about the developing world.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest gender gaps that we have in the developed world is science, technology, and
That's right.
engineering and mathematics education for women. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on will technology shrink that gap or provide more opportunities for STEM education for women?
Well, I think that's a terrific question. And what I would say is that this is where I feel like having a global perspective or looking around the world is a really useful thing to do. Because in the United States, we think, oh, well, how are we going to solve the problem of the fact that women are not in these STEM fields or have less access to technology or whatever? Well, I mean, one of the interesting things is when you look around the world, this problem is really an American cultural problem. Right? So if you go to India, if you go to some of these countries where mathematics are held in high regard, where people emphasize the STEM disciplines, treat them with respect right from a young age, girls participate in them as much as men, and in fact they had to invent quotas in some of these countries to keep the girls out. So Kuwait, for example, and some other of these countries where women were applying for these graduate and higher education programs, women have very high levels of education in the STEM disciplines. They are extremely accomplished in these areas, and so it's very hard to maintain something like some kind of story about, well, it's probably biological if you just bother looking around the world. Just like people in Saudi Arabia, if they came here, would probably realize that it's okay to have women drive. If we go to these other places where women are participating in mathematics, if you look at the Math Olympiad in the United States and you look at the women who are likely to succeed in the United States, they're nearly all immigrant women. They're nearly all women from India, they're women from other places where mathematical abilities have been valued culturally, are promoted, and are supported. So It's really a cultural problem to a large degree. So that goes back to this first question, and that's one of the reasons I love this question so much, which is about what do we do to improve access? I mean, one of the things that tells us is that culturally, this is largely a cultural problem. I don't know if you've been following some of the discussion about computer science recently, but before computer science became the kind of hot technology field that it is today, and this is very topical with these discussions at Google and elsewhere, women actually outnumbered men in computer science and were very well represented in computer science. And it's only recently that the proportion of women in computer science has become so low, and it's concomitant with the higher prestige of the job. So, I mean, as we say that this is a more desirable job, as more men are trying to get into that discipline, it's harder for women to be in that discipline. And then we suddenly hear all these ideas about whether, women are good enough or naturally fit or whether they're interested in it. I mean, women invented the computer, right? So, I mean, if you think about Lovelace and some of the kind of history of this. So I guess I think that, some of our problems about women in STEM disciplines here are largely attitudinal and cultural. And we don't really address that very much as we probably should. And so the appropriate responses are things that address attitudinal and cultural problems rather than say, like, fix women. So we have to make sure that there are role models. We have to make sure that people understand that it's appropriate to have women, and that, in fact, if we don't involve women in these disciplines, we're not going to have the kinds of advances even that we have right now. We wouldn't have the kinds of computers and technological advances that we have right now if women weren't involved. So it's really important to get women into these disciplines so that they can be good disciplines. It'll be good for women, of course, to have more access to these disciplines, but really, we as a society need to not hold back half of our population so that we can have the kinds of advances of understanding, the deep understandings that would be possible. I don't know if you guys know the work by Scott Page, which looks at diversity in teams. So he wrote a book in 2008, I think it was called The Difference. But lots of other studies too, but this is kind of, if you're going to look at one thing, you might get this book. This book compared teams that were diverse with teams that scored well on things like standardized tests, very traditional type of merit-based ideas. Every single time on a wide variety of complex tasks, it only applies to really complex tasks, diverse teams outperformed those teams comprised of sort of traditionally merit-based individuals, people selected on those traditional merit-based. Diverse teams outperform them tremendously, and I could tell you more about that if you're interested in it. But the bottom line is that if we want to be able to continue to have innovation in technology, in science, if we want to have excellence, if we want to have the best new ideas, if we want to be the best problem solvers, then we must involve women in those disciplines. We need women to enter those disciplines so that we don't fall behind. That's, I think, an important cultural message for us to understand. So all of the things, we know that in terms of, so when women go into these disciplines in the United States, they are working against tremendous cultural pressures not to participate in those disciplines. So they get messages from a young age, whether the Barbie was that said, math is hard, let's go shopping, the little Barbie voice. This is the kind of the dolls that people are getting. They're not being encouraged. Women are being pushed into these fields. And we have to counter that. We have to actually actively counter that by encouraging women and girls to pursue STEM disciplines. We have to have, Purdue has these excellent programs, you may know, women in engineering programs that involve women in science and technology projects and get them to think about these things. So there are, we have to have women themselves understand that when they say to themselves, this is hard, maybe I'm not good enough, that might reflect a message that's coming from society and no reflection of whether they actually belong in that discipline. So just as people feel discomfort going to a bank where there's no woman to serve them, or maybe feel uncomfortable driving, in the United States, our task here is to think about, well, maybe my discomfort in a science or technology field comes from an inappropriate cultural message that's going to keep me down and keep my society back, and I can't let that be the rule. So I hope that's enough of an answer. I appreciate the question.
I think that's that point is another good reason to come back to your point about women's empowerment being part of this. And one of the things that we heard yesterday from the Monsanto speaker is he was basically equating world hunger to the reluctance of people to know more about science and to be open to GMOs and et cetera, without really looking at any of these issues about gender or about the economic And so we see this kind of courage of women's organizing and movements that move toward these changes. Eventually, 25 years later, may begin to see some of these changes. So I really appreciate when we see things that let young women, rural women, others, I mean, the cell phone termination that I've seen in African countries is really great. It's tremendous. People are talking to their internationally people all the time, and adding that idea of transferring money has really emboldened, I think, a lot of women and men. So I think technology can be really helpful, but it does have to be in the context of a cultural situation where you have empowerment. And that's a good reason for our engineers to study political science and technology and anthropology and other fields to help really understand those human factors, because that ultimately is going to make a major difference. So just as, the rest of us need to study engineering and how projects work and how do you put an economy together, I think we need each other, and that's why teams are so important. And it's really cool what you just said about teamwork. I love that. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you are on the
No.
corporations issue.
Yeah.
We have just about a moment left.
Okay. I think on the corporations issue, I guess I think that the answer to that question, which it's a little bit of a cop-out, but I do think that the answer to that question has to be very context-specific and strategic. So, for example, I guess I think that if you're getting the World Economic Forum to talk about women, it's probably better than them not talking about women, even if it's, but if they're the only ones talking about women, then that'll be a problem. And if it ends up that Human Rights Watch or the Global Fund for Women to start, it's more worrying that UN Women is talking about investing in women as it's an intergovernmental body. Why are they trying to make money? They're supposed to be pursuing governmental goals. It'd be like if our government was trying to make money from us, it would be a little bit disturbing. But it's not disturbing if some big company decides to take on a corporate responsibility to try to do some good. That's a different kind of an issue than when a different kind of entity takes on those goals. So I think that both the kind of actor in question matters, and also the context. So some places, it's hugely radical to say that women should be able to run a business. And in other cases, it's not very radical to say that, right? So I think that it really matters in the context and what counts as a step forward and what's possible in that context. And that some things that may not seem very radical in some contexts are pretty radical in other contexts. So I guess I think that kind of contextual question about who's doing the acting and who's doing the investing and in what context and in what reason exactly helps us maybe sort out what kind of sense it makes, if that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you so much for